Welcome to our 10th and last class on Jesus and his parables. Today we will look at the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Let's begin by setting the stage. During the time of Jesus, daily services in the temple included music for public worship, sacrifices, prayers, and blessings from the priests. The sacrifice of atonement was an important part of the service. It consisted of the sacrifice of a lamb at dawn and again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sacrifice was meant to cover the sins of Israel. This part of the service was marked by the priest burning incense, and the worshipers knew that when they smelled the incense, they could approach God with their personal prayers. It's likely that the two men in Jesus' parable were at the temple during the time of one of these sacrifices, along with the other people who also attended the service. Now, let's turn to the parable. I'd encourage you to download the handout of the text found on the class website, then follow along. In the opening verse, Jesus explains the reason for the parable. Some people considered themselves righteous because they followed the law very strictly. Remember, the word righteous means being in a right relationship with God and others. So the subject of the parable is righteousness. We know from Luke chapter 17, verse 20, that there were Pharisees in the crowd while Jesus taught. The Pharisees prided themselves on how strictly they kept the law and looked down on those they believed fell short, even to the point of despising them. The hated Roman government had a system for collecting taxes that used local Jewish people to gather the taxes to deliver them to Rome. Anyone who collected taxes for the Romans was considered a Roman collaborator and a traitor to the Jewish people. So a tax collector would be the most obvious person for the Pharisees to despise because they were clearly unrighteous. As Jesus begins the parable, it appears both the Pharisee and the tax collector walked to the temple together, along with the other worshipers. The fact the Pharisee stands apart from the other worshipers is important. Other people didn't observe the Pharisaic laws of cleanliness or tithing as strictly as the Pharisees did, so in the Pharisees' eyes, they were unclean. If the Pharisee even just brushed up against an ordinary person, he'd be unclean. A Pharisee cannot compromise their state of cleanliness for any reason. Remember the laws around cleanliness we talked about in the parable of the Good Samaritan? The Pharisee stands apart because he believes others aren't worthy to be in his presence. When incense was burned, it was a signal for personal prayers, and the unclean had to move towards the eastern gate, where they were to stand on the margins. You have to wonder if the tax collector didn't move with the rest of the crowd and stuck out, since the Pharisee specifically names him in his prayer. It was the Jewish practice to pray out loud, but this kind of praying is more like talking to yourself rather than making sure everyone could hear you. In Jewish understanding, prayer is for thanking and praising God for his good gifts and asking for what you need. But notice several things about the Pharisee's prayer. First, the Pharisee isn't talking to himself as he prays. He wants to be heard. So instead of praying, he's preaching to the rabble around him. The Pharisee boasts about his self-righteousness, congratulating himself on how pious he is. This is self-promotion, not prayer. Then his prayer goes from bad to worse when he makes a list of sinners, maybe to point out the tax collector who is standing near him. His list of sinners includes extortioners and the unjust, which are code words. Those who collected taxes for Rome were traditionally known as extortioners and unjust swindlers. Then the Pharisee throws in adulterers for good measure. Maybe he's making an assumption about the tax collector, just like the older son in the parable of the prodigal son did when he implied his little brother squandered his inheritance on prostitutes. You see, the Pharisee's prayer isn't actually a prayer, but a public attack on his fellow worshipers based on assumptions. He holds himself up as a model of righteousness and prays about other people's sins and how much better he is compared to everyone else. Now we know why the Pharisee thinks he's so righteous when he proudly lists why he's such a great person. He fasts twice a week and tithes all his income. Interestingly enough, the law only required people to fast one day a year on the Day of Atonement. In the time of Jesus, a faction of Pharisees took fasting to an extreme, fasting twice a week. Apparently, this Pharisee counted himself among this elite circle. We know the law did require tithes to be paid, but only on grain, wine, and oil, not on a person's entire income. Once again, the Pharisee boasted about going above and beyond the requirements of the law. We get a glimpse of the Pharisee's self-understanding in his prayer. He's so respectable and virtuous. Of course, God loves him best. Now, Jesus turns to the tax collector. This is the defining moment in Jesus' parable. The tax collector stands far off because he doesn't feel worthy to stand with the other worshipers. A cultural nuance provides an interesting tidbit about the tax collector's posture during prayer. The conventional posture for prayer was to stand with your arms folded across your chest, keeping your eyes down. But the tax collector can't keep his hands still, instead beating on his chest in distress. In the Middle East, it is women who beat their chest in anger or sorrow, for instance, when grieving at a funeral. But men do not display their emotions this way. It would take the most extreme circumstances for a man to beat his chest. But the tax collector is experiencing extreme pain because of his sins. The tax collector's prayer is short and sweet, not like the Pharisees. Instead of telling God how great he is, the tax collector wants all that he's just witnessed during the temple service, the worship with trumpets, cymbals, and choirs, the reading of the psalms, the smoke from the sacrifice, the burning of incense, the blessing of the priests, the people bowing down, to include him too. He knows he's a sinner and needs the atonement sacrifice to touch and change his life. He recognizes he cannot justify or defend himself and must lean on God's mercy and love. Jesus' parable starts with two men going up to the temple and ends with a surprise. The Pharisee thought the tax collector didn't have any value or hope before God. Yet it is the tax collector who is made righteous before God. What a reversal of expectations. The atonement sacrifice is worthless for anyone who doesn't think they need it. It's only those who approach God in humility, as sinners who don't deserve God's grace, who are the ones that actually receive that grace. The humble are exalted, and those who want to exalt themselves will be humbled. Righteousness isn't something we can earn or produce through our own effort, but it is a gift from God. We must humbly approach God as the sinners we are, and know he will welcome us as saints because of what Jesus has done on the cross for us. To summarize this parable, the parable is directed at all those who think they can justify themselves and their own righteousness. The Pharisee elevated the letter of the law above the spirit of the law. The Pharisee thought going above and beyond requirements of the law made him special in God's eyes. But the tax collector understood his true condition before God. He's a sinner in need of saving, which only God can do. We cannot earn or manufacture righteousness. It is a gift from God. The humble will be exalted, and those who try to exalt themselves will be humbled. This ends our class on Jesus and his parables. I pray you understand a little more about our good and faithful God and how to live into that truth in your everyday lives, pursuing him with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And as always, keep the faith.